It is one of the minor ironies of my life that, having survived Afghan bullets and the more insidious hazards of London practice, I should find my nerves most sharply tested by a door. Not any door, of course, but that one. I had lived long enough with Sherlock Holmes to know that the commonplace may, upon occasion, become the very mask of terror. I had seen a scrap of blotting paper, a smear of candle grease, and the curve of a boot-heel topple, conspiracies that had the weight of ministries behind them. Yet never, in all our varied companionship, had I known the familiar sitting room at Baker Street to harbor a secret which pressed upon the mind with so cold a hand as the sealed chamber did in that peculiar winter of '89. Holmes himself had called it Soth, the sealed room, with that faint lift of the brow which served him for emphasis, and with no more explanation than would have been given to a man who understood. The thing began, as such things often did, with an interruption to breakfast. A morning in Baker Street the fog lay thick upon London. Not the theatrical curtain which the penny papers delighted in describing, but a low, greasy vapor that clung to one's coat and left the throat raw. From our windows, the opposite houses in Baker Street had the indistinct air of charcoal drawings. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps creaked above and below like the measured tread of a ship's carpenter, and the fire in our grate snapped faintly as though it, too, resented the damp. Holmes was in one of his quiet moods, rare, but always to be treasured. He sat in the armchair nearest the light, his long fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. Before him, upon his knees, lay neither chemical apparatus nor newspaper, but a violin case, closed, as if even music were being held in reserve. I, for my part, had just opened the Standard when he spoke. "You have been to see a patient in Marylebone these past 3 Thursdays." I looked up sharply. "Indeed, Holmes. And may I ask you, left at 9:15? You returned in time to ring the bell at 10 minutes to 11. You walked rather than took a hansom. You were annoyed upon each occasion, my dear fellow," I began. But he held up a languid hand. "The hem of your greatcoat bears the clay of Paddington Basin, not the sandy mixture of the South Bank, but that dark, oily stuff which clings near the water. You have a faint smell of carbolic hospital, not private surgery, yet your cuffs show no recent bloodstain. Therefore, consultation rather than operation. The annoyance is betrayed by the way you fold your paper over precise. One concludes an official impediment, perhaps a clerk who keeps you waiting." He opened his eyes at last and permitted himself a thin smile. "You see, my dear Watson, even when London is invisible from the window, it leaves its traces upon those who move within it." "I protest that you make me sound like a parcel delivered by rail," said I, laughing in spite of myself. "But you are right in all particulars. The patient is the wife of a government man, an excellent woman, and the clerks are indeed insufferable." Holmes's smile faded as quickly as it came. He had that swift, hawk-like change of attention which I had learned to associate with the approach of something. Some vibration upon the thread of his world. A sharp rap sounded below, brisk and authoritative. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose faintly in remonstrance. The rap came again, followed by the unmistakable tramp of a man who considered doors as obstacles to be corrected rather than respected. Holmes sat up. "That is not a client," said he. "That is Lestrade." The official visitor, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, entered with the air of one who has been dragged from warmth into discomfort and resents the universe for it. His cheeks were red with cold. The fog had beaded upon his hat brim and collar. Yet, for all his habitual sharpness, there was in his eyes that morning an uneasiness which I had rarely observed in him. "Morning, Mr. Holmes." "Morning, Doctor." His gaze flicked to the violin case. "I hope I'm not disturbing your amusements." "My occupations," said Holmes mildly. "Pray, sit down. You are wet through, Lestrade. Watson, if you ring, Mrs. Hudson will bring you some tea, unless you prefer brandy. The case, I fancy, will be the sort which calls for it. Lestrade's mouth tightened. That's just it. I don't know what sort it calls for. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. Excellent. Proceed. The inspector sat, but only upon the edge of the chair, as if a full surrender to comfort were a tactical mistake. You've heard of Mr. Silas Crowninshield? Holmes's eyelids fluttered. The antiquary specializes in private collections, rare manuscripts, seals, oddities of the late Georgian period. A man who sells the romance of age to the newly rich. He has a shop in Montague Street. Yes, Lestrade's fingers worried at his gloves. He's dead, in his shop. I asked. In a room above it, said Lestrade. And that's where the trouble begins. Holmes leaned forward a fraction. Locked room. Lestrade stared. Yes, but it ain't a parlor trick. It's clean. To clean. Holmes's nostrils flared his way of showing interest. A sealed room. How sealed? Lestrade hesitated, as if even stating the facts might make them absurd. Sealed, Mr. Holmes, in the strict meaning. Door locked from the inside. Windows fastened and painted over rolled frames, you know, that don't open easy anyhow. The key was on the inside. No chimney large enough for a child. We forced it. And there he was, Silas Crowninshield, lying on his back, arms at his sides as if laid out proper. No sign of a struggle. No weapon. No papers missing that we can tell. And he swallowed. And the room wasn't empty neither. Holmes held his gaze. What else was in it? A man, said Lestrade. Alive. I found my pipe arrested midway to my lips. Alive in the same room with the corpse. Lestrade nodded, his face hardening in self-defense against the incredulity he anticipated. Sitting in a chair in the corner, like he'd been waiting. Calm as you please. And he says, Lestrade's voice dropped. He says he stepped out of a room at Baker Street. Out of your room, Holmes did not start. He did not exclaim. Yet I saw, in that instant, the change which had made him formidable to every criminal mind in England. The languor drained away. His pupils sharpened. The whole man became attentive, predatory. Did he specify the address? Asked Holmes quietly. Lestrade's glance went to me, then back. He said, 221B, Baker Street. The sealed room. A silence fell upon us, filled only by the faint hiss of the fire. I became aware of the fog pressing against the panes like a living thing. Holmes's voice, when it came, was perfectly composed. Describe this man. 35 to 40. Well-dressed, but not a gentleman if you take my meaning. Hands too smooth for labor, too restless for good breeding. A thin scar under the jaw. And eyes. Lestrade grimaced. Eyes like a man who's seen something that ain't fit for daylight and won't ever forget it. Holmes rose. Watson, my coat. I stood with him, for I knew that tone. Holmes, what of this sealed room at Baker Street? What can the fellow mean? Holmes's mouth tightened slightly. What he means, my dear fellow, is either nonsense or something which touches upon a matter I had hoped never to open again. Lestrade blinked. Open again? Holmes turned those gray, disconcerting eyes upon him. Inspector, you came here because you have a locked room and a dead antiquary. You now also have, it seems, a living man who claims to have stepped from a sealed chamber within my own lodgings. If you desire my assistance, you will keep two facts, and you will do as I tell you. Lestrade bristled instinctively, then subsided, for he had long ago learned that Holmes's arrogance was not an affectation, but a natural condition. All right, facts it is. Holmes took his coat from my hand, and with a quick movement, slipped something into the inside pocket old magnifying lens. Of course, but I also saw the corner of a small, flat object wrapped in oilcloth, which I did not recognize. He noticed my glance and said nothing. "Watson," said he, "before we go, I must ask you a question. It is a small one, but answer it exactly." "Certainly. Last night after you retired, did you hear me leave my room?" I considered. Holmes, in his sleepless habits, was often moving about at late hours. "No, I heard nothing." "And did you hear anyone else moving on the stairs? Any unusual sound wood creaking, a door's latch, Mrs. Hudson's cat anything?" "Nothing," I said, feeling a chill that did not arise from the weather. Holmes nodded, as if my answer completed a calculation. "Good." Lestrade was staring. "Mr. Holmes, you speak as if there's already a sealed room in this house." Holmes turned toward the narrow passage which led to the back of the flat. His eyes rested for a moment upon a plain door, which, to any casual observer, might have belonged to a pantry or spare closet. Its surface was unremarkable. Yet I, who knew the geography of our lodgings as a man knows the lines upon his own palm, felt a sudden tightening in the chest. That door had not always been there. I had never asked Holmes about it. Holmes had never offered. In our life together there had been a tacit agreement that certain corners of his past were to remain in shadow. As one leaves unexamined the recesses of a theater, lest the machinery spoil the illusion. Now Holmes crossed to it and laid his fingers lightly upon the handle, as one might touch the lid of a coffin. "It is sealed," said he, "and it has been sealed at my insistence." Lestrade's voice was rough. "Sealed how?" Holmes looked over his shoulder, and for once there was something in his expression I did not care to name, something older than his usual cold amusement. "With wax," said he. "With law." "With a promise. And if I am not mistaken this morning, with a lie." He drew from his pocket a small pocket knife, not the penknife Watson carries for trifles, but a narrow-bladed instrument of excellent steel. He knelt, and I saw then what I had somehow not noticed before. A strip of dark red sealing wax pressed along the seam where the door met its frame, stamped in 2 places with an impressionant antique signet mark, blurred by time. Holmes's thumb traced the impression. "A crown and shield seal," he murmured. "How very neat. You know him, then?" said Lestrade. "I know of him," said Holmes, and the emphasis was peculiar. "Watson, do you observe anything?" I bent closer. The wax was cracked in one place, very fine cracks, as though the door had been eased ever so slightly, and then pressed shut again. The stamp was smeared at the edge too, in a manner inconsistent with a seal left untouched. "It has been disturbed," said I. Holmes's eyes flicked up in approval. "Precisely. Not broken, disturbed. Someone has been careful. Someone has had time." Lestrade stood, suddenly impatient. "Mr. Holmes, with respect, there's a man sitting in a locked room with a corpse, and you're here playing with wax." Holmes rose in one smooth movement. "Inspector, that wax is the hinge upon which your locked room turns." He snapped the knife shut. For an instant he stood quite still, as if listening not to sound but to the very structure of the morning. Then he stepped back from the sealed door. "I shall not open it," said he, and there was finality in the words. "Not yet." I confess my relief was immediate and my unease greater for it. Holmes turned briskly. "Come to Montague Street." And Lestrade, his voice sharpened. "Tell no one at the Yard that this door exists." Lestrade's brows rose. "Why in blazes not?" Holmes's gaze was like frost. "Because the moment the Yard hears of a secret, it becomes public property. And because, Inspector, if the man in Crown and Shield's room truly stepped from here, then we are not dealing merely with murder, but with a design that has been in motion for years." He paused, and his lips curved in that slight, cold smile which I had learned to dread on behalf of our adversaries, "and I have no intention of allowing my own house to become a crime scene. The journey begins. We descended into Baker Street, and the fog swallowed us at once. It muffled the hoofbeats and blurred the gas lamps into dull halos. As we walked home, striding quickly, Lestrade hunched and silent. Myself struggling to keep pace, I could not rid my mind of the image Lestrade had painted. A corpse laid out neat as a parish offering, and in the same room a living man waiting, claiming to have stepped from 2 to 1B as from a dream. Holmes hailed a hansom at last, and we climbed within. For a time none of us spoke. Then Holmes said, as if continuing a private thought, "It is always the seal, Watson, the seal. The thing which men believe secures them," said he. "A lock, a stamp, a promise. They press wax upon paper and imagine the universe obliged to respect it. They forget that wax records not only closure, but touch." Lestrade shifted. "Mr. Holmes, are you saying this antiquary was mixed up in something to do with you?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that a sealed room is never merely sealed. It is watched. And if it has been opened if only a hair's breadth, then someone wished it known that it could be." He fell silent again. Through the little trapdoor in the roof, I could see the fog thinning as we neared Bloomsbury, and the outlines of buildings emerged like dark ships from mist. My thoughts returned, against my will, to the door above our sitting room, the wax, the ancient signet, the faint cracks like hairlines in ice. Holmes's hand upon the handle had been steady, yet something in his voice had not been. Holmes was not a man given to superstition. He despised the irrational with a contempt as absolute as it was justified. And yet, if I may be forgiven the admission, there are moments when the most logical mind is forced to look upon the abyss and acknowledge that it exists. The hansom jolted to a stop. Lestrade leaned forward and threw open the door. "Montague Street," said he shortly. Holmes stepped out into the damp air, and I followed, the taste of fog and coal smoke in my mouth. Ahead of us, through the thinning haze, a narrow-fronted shop came into view, its windows crowded with old books, tarnished silver, and curious little boxes which caught the weak winter light. Above the door, in gold letters now dulled by grime, I read, "S. Crown and Shield Rare Objects and Private Colecto." ECTO and S stood for a moment, looking up at the dark windows above the shop. Then he said, very softly, so that only I could hear, Lestrade ushered us through Crown and Shield's shop, where the air held that mingled perfume of dust, old leather, and metal polish which clings to rooms that trade in the past. I observed my companion's glance move with swift economy over the crowded cases, miniatures in tarnished frames, a nest of signet rings, a cracked ivory diptyque. He gave them no more than a passing acknowledgment, as a huntsman notes the birds while his mind is fixed upon the fox. The inspector pushed open a door behind the counter, and we mounted a narrow stair whose treads complained beneath our feet. At the landing he paused, as though reluctant to bring us at once upon the ugliness above, and produced from his pocket a key which he turned with a deliberate care. "Locked from the inside when we found it," said he. "We had to force it, but I've kept the lock as it was after." Holmes's hand hovered an instant over the brass escutcheon. Then, with that curious tenderness he sometimes showed to inanimate things which had been used as instruments of deceit, he traced the scratches about the keyhole. Forced by a constable with impatience and a crowbar, he remarked, "Not by the criminal, at least." The door swung inward, and the room received us like a held breath released. It was a plain chamber under the eaves, low-ceilinged, with a single gas jet turned down until it gave more smell than light. A small coal fire smoldered in the grate, yet the place was cold, as if warmth could not persuade it to be human. Upon the floor, in the center, lay Silas Crowninshield. He had the neat, folded dignity of a man arranged by other hands, boots aligned, coat buttoned, chin lifted a fraction, as if death had been coached into respectability. I stepped forward, physician first, and knelt beside him. The skin was waxy and already stiff at the jaw. There were no bruises at the wrists, no torn cloth, no sign of frenzy. Holmes did not come near at once. He stood a pace inside the threshold, letting his gaze travel, patient as light. "No blood," I said quietly. "No obvious wound." Lestrade's voice came from behind me. "That's why it's a devil of a thing, Doctor. He looks as if he simply stopped." Holmes's reply was absent, for his attention had settled upon the window. It was a single sash, its frame thick with old paint, the sort landlords ignore until it becomes part of the architecture. The latch was down. The panes were dull with fog. Holmes leaned in, and his fingers, very gently, brushed the sill. When he drew them back, I saw a faint sparkle of grit upon the tips, as though powdered brick had been sprinkled there. Only then did I notice the other presence in the room. A chair stood in the far corner, angled not to face the body, but the door. In it sat a man of medium height, neatly dressed in dark broadcloth, his hat upon his knee. He rose as we entered, and bowed with an odd, old-fashioned precision. His face was pale, but not with fear. Rather with a strained composure, the sort a man adopts when he has decided that panic will not improve his circumstances. A thin scar curved under his jaw where a razor might have slipped long ago. His eyes, however, were the most striking, thin clear, gray-brown, and fixed upon Holmes with the careful intensity of one who has sought him out and now measures the cost of finding him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he. His voice was soft, educated, yet held a roughness at the edges, as though he had not spoken much of late. "I have been waiting." Lestrade stepped forward with official irritation. "Name?" he demanded. The man's gaze never left Holmes. "Felix Darby," he answered. "And before you ask, Inspector, I have not killed Mr. Crowninshield." Holmes's head tilted a fraction. "You have the advantage of us, Mr. Darby," said he. "You know my name, and I do not know your business." Darby's fingers tightened upon his hat brim. "My business is your room," said he, and the words made the air in that attic seem suddenly thinner. "The sealed room at Baker Street. I stepped out of it less than an hour before you came." Lestrade barked a laugh without humor. "And I came out of the Tower of London last night," said he. "Try a better tale." Darby's eyes flicked to the door and back, as if the walls themselves were listening. "I do not require you to believe me," said he, "only to understand that if you treat this as an ordinary murder, you will bury the wrong man and loose the right one." Holmes moved at last. Not toward Darby, but along the perimeter of the room, as a mathematician might walk the edges of a diagram. He paused by a small escritoire against the wall. Its drawers were shut, yet the writing slope was open an inch, as if someone had meant to close it and changed his mind. Holmes inserted a finger delicately and opened it. Inside lay a sheet of thick cream paper, unaddressed, folded once. He did not open it tonely, lifted it, and sniffed. "Sandalwood," he murmured, "and sealing wax." He returned it, untouched. His attention shifted to the carpet beneath Crownshield's heels. "Notice, Watson," he said, "how the nap lies." I bent close and saw it. The pile ran smooth toward the window, except for two faint disturbances, one a drag mark, straight and narrow, leading from the hearth to the center. The other a scuff near the chair, as if a foot had tapped there again and again in impatience. "You waited," said Holmes, turning at last upon Darby, "long enough to wear the carpet and calm your breathing. Yet your cuffs are clean, your knees unmarked. You did not move the body. You did not search. You were afraid to touch anything." Darby's composure faltered, just for a heartbeat. "Yes," he whispered, "because I knew you would read it." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then you came not as a suspect, but as a messenger," said he. "And you chose this room because its door could be locked from within, and because the dead man would compel the yard to keep others out." Lestrade flushed. "Are you saying he planned the whole thing?" he snapped. Holmes held up a hand, and Lestrade, astonishingly, quieted. "Not the whole," Holmes said, "but enough." Darby swallowed. "Crowninshield promised me safety," he said. "He collected things, seals, letters, relics, things that bind men to their past. He said he could keep one secret for me behind a lock and wax, and that it would never be opened again. But last night someone did open it. Not fully, only enough. And when I went to Baker Street to warn you, your sealed door, was already marked with his sign." Holmes's face did not change, yet I felt the quickening in him, like a hound scenting a trail. "Describe exactly what you saw," said he. Darby's eyes darted once to mine, as if seeking reassurance in a soldier's frankness, and then back to Holmes. "A strip of red wax along the seam," he said. "2 stamps. And a crack here," he raised a finger to indicate, "at the lower hinge line, as if someone had eased it and shut it again." Holmes's mouth tightened. He glanced at the window, at the grit upon his fingertips, at the untouched folded letter in the escritoire. "And you stepped out of it," he said softly, "because someone wished you to." Holmes led us from the attic chamber with a swiftness that was the more remarkable because it was controlled. He gave no outward sign of the disturbance which I knew must be working within him. Yet his mind moved audibly, as it were, in the crispness of his brief directions. Lestrade was ordered to leave 2 men at the shop door and 1 upon the stair, with strict instructions that no clerk, customer, or curious neighbor should set foot above. The inspector, still smarting at the notion that the affair might be more subtle than his handcuffs, grumbled but obeyed. For the presence of Felix Darby, calm, articulate, and singularly unafraid of authority, had shaken his usual certainty. Darby walked at Holmes's side like a man who has chosen his guide and will not be parted from him. And more than once I saw his eyes dart to the windows, as though he expected some watching face to form in the gray. Outside, the fog had thinned into a cold drizzle which turned the street into a shining ribbon. Holmes hailed a cab, and within minutes we were rattling back toward Baker Street. He spoke little, but his silence was not empty. It was laden. Once, when the cab jolted over a rut, Darby's hand shot to his inner pocket in a reflex that was half protective, half guilty. Holmes's gaze flicked there and away with the ease of a man noting the position of a chess piece. "You carry something you fear to lose," he observed. Darby's lips tightened. "Something I fear to keep," he corrected. Holmes's eyes narrowed, but he did not press him. That restraint, in Holmes, was always deliberate. We had scarcely crossed Marylebone Road when Holmes rapped twice upon the cab roof. "Stop here," said he. "Watson, come with me. Lestrade, you will take Darby straight to the rooms and keep him there within sight, Inspector, but without irons. If you clap him in bracelets, you will make him desperate, and desperate men simplify matters with pistols." Lestrade protested, but Holmes's glance ended the matter. "Very well," he muttered. "But if he bolts, he will not," said Holmes. And that was all. We stepped down into the wet street, leaving the cab to continue. Holmes set off at once, not toward Baker Street, but along a narrower lane which I recognized as one of those passages where tradesmen's carts cut behind the more respectable fronts. "Holmes," I began, "surely our first duty is to examine that sealed door." "Our first duty," he answered, "is to discover whether we are followed." He walked with the easy aimlessness of an idler. Yet I saw how he used every puddle as a mirror and every shop window as a glass. Twice he paused to light his pipe, and each time his match flared, he used the reflection in the flame to glance behind without turning his head. Presently he led me into a small tobacconist, bought nothing, and emerged by the back, which opened upon a different street. "There," said he quietly, "that relieves me. You saw someone?" "I saw no one," said he. Which, in London, is the surest proof that someone is trying to be invisible. We returned at last to Baker Street by a roundabout course. When we entered our lodgings, Lestrade was already within, standing stiffly by the mantel, as if he expected the furniture to accuse him. Darby sat upon the edge of the settee, hat in hand, his posture composed, but his knee betraying him with a faint, incessant tremor. Mrs. Hudson hovered in the doorway with a tray, her kindly face drawn with anxiety. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "is it true there's been murder?" "Nothing for you to trouble over, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes gently, and the softness of his tone startled me more than any harshness could have done. "Kindly leave us, and if any gentleman calls, tell him we are not at home." When she had withdrawn, Holmes crossed at once to the passage and the plain door which had so lately become the focus of my thoughts. In the stronger light of our sitting room, the wax showed darker, like dried blood against the paint. Holmes did not at once cut it. Instead, he knelt, drew from his pocket a lens, and examined the stamp impressions with minute care. "Crown and Shield signet," he murmured, "or a perfect copy. Watson, observe the outer rim, too sharp. An old seal wears at the edges. This is as crisp as a newly struck coin." He leaned closer still, and I saw his nostrils flare. "Sandalwood again," said he. "The same scent as the paper in the escritoire. Our friend the antiquary has been in correspondence, and the correspondent has access to his habits." He rose, and for a moment his hand rested flat upon the door. Not upon the handle, but upon the wood itself, as if he could feel through it. When he spoke again, his voice had that brisk, almost surgical quality which meant his emotions were being locked away behind work. "Lestrade," said he, "tell me precisely, when you forced Crown and Shield's door, was the seal intact?" "No seal," said Lestrade. "Only the lock and the window paint. Old, cracked, looked like it hadn't been touched in years." Holmes nodded. "Yet there was grit on the sill," I interjected, recalling the sparkle upon his fingers. Holmes's eyes met mine. "Brick dust," he said, "from a fresh drill hole, most likely. Someone has made an opening small enough to admit air, sound, perhaps a thin wire." Lestrade snorted. "A wire won't kill a man and leave him laid out neat." "No," said Holmes, "but a wire may deliver what kills him." Darby's face had gone paler. "You're speaking of gas," he said hoarsely. Holmes looked at him sharply. "I am speaking of methods," he answered. "You, Mr. Darby, are speaking from knowledge. Be careful which you choose." At that Darby's composure cracked. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and his voice dropped. "I was in that room," he said. "Not this door beyond it. The place you sealed. Crown and Shield put me there months ago, when I needed to vanish. He said it was safe because no one but he and you knew it existed. There's a second way out, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade straightened as if jerked by a string. "A second way?" Holmes's eyes were hard. "Where?" Darby swallowed. "Into the next house," he said. "Through a bricked-up service passage. You can hear them sometimes footsteps, a child crying. I never used it. Crown and Shield forbade it. He said it was compromised." Holmes's fingers tightened upon the knife in his pocket. I saw the movement through the cloth. "Compromised," he repeated, "meaning someone else knows." Lestrade took a step toward the door. "Then we open it now," said he. Holmes's head snapped around. "You will do nothing of the sort," he said, and the authority in him halted the inspector as if struck. "If this door is opened without preparation, we may invite in precisely what our enemy wishes to send." Lestrade flushed, but held his tongue. Holmes turned to me, and I saw then, beneath all the discipline, the brief flash of something like regret. "Watson," he said, "you asked once years ago what I had been before I met you. I told you that curiosity is dangerous, said I quietly. And you were right. Then trust me now, he answered. For if Darby speaks truth, the sealed room is not merely a hiding place. It is a corridor in a larger design. He looked from Darby to Lestrade and back to me. And someone has just reminded me that in London, doctors, there are doors which were built to be forgotten till the day they are needed. He drew the knife at last, placed its point to the wax, and paused as if listening for a sound on the other side. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. Then, instead of cutting, he withdrew the blade and slipped it away again. Not yet, he said softly. First, we will learn who re-stamped this seal and why Crowninshield died with his hands so neatly folded. Lestrade, fetch me the list of Crownenshield's most recent clients and correspondents, every title, every address, every servant who carried a parcel. Darby, you will sit here and write, from memory, every object that was in that sealed room beyond this door, down to the last scrap of paper and the last smell in the air. Watson, you will do what you do best. Watch me and tell me when I cease to be myself. I confess the last words struck me more than all the talk of gas and hidden passages. Holmes had turned toward the window, his profile sharp against the dull light. And for an instant I thought I saw upon his face not the joy of the chase, but the shadow of a man pursued. Holmes set us to our tasks with the crispness of a commander allotting ground before an engagement. Lestrade, still muttering, took up his hat and went out into the wet street to telegraph the yard, and procure what names he could from Crownenshield's ledgers. Darby drew a sheet of paper toward him, and began to write with the cramped intensity of a man pouring out a confession while he yet possessed the courage. I placed myself at the table opposite him, ostensibly to help, but in truth to watch his hand, his breathing, and the small betraying movements which tell more of a narrative than the words themselves. Holmes paced, halted, returned to the mantel, and stood staring down into the fire as if it were a lens through which he might observe events at a distance. The first thing Darby wrote was not an object, but a smell, sandalwood and varnish, old paper, a damp that never dries. He paused, pressed his pen hard enough to splinter the nib, and began again with items more tangible: an iron bedstead without mattress, a wooden chair, a small shelf, 2 candles, a chipped basin. He described a narrow room with a ceiling so low that a tall man must stoop, and walls that had once been whitewashed but were now the color of old bone. No window, he wrote, only an air grate at floor level with a faint draught. No sound of the street only at night, a distant rumble and sometimes the soft thud of movement behind brick. The passage, he added, is behind the shelf. Crowninshield showed me the seam. It was bricked and plastered to look solid, but hollow when you tapped it. Holmes had turned at the first mention of the air grate. He came over and looked down at Darby's paper without seeming to read it. "How did you eat?" he asked abruptly. Darby's throat worked. "Crowninshield brought food," he said. "At irregular hours. Sometimes he would knock twice, then once, and I'd move the shelf aside and he'd pass it through a gap. He warned me never to light both candles at once." He gave a humorless laugh. He said the air was precious. Holmes's eyes flicked to the sealed door in our passage. "An air grate," he murmured, "and a warning about flame. You see, Watson? Even a hiding place has a metabolism." He looked back to Darby. "When did you last see Crowninshield alive?" "Yesterday evening," said Darby, "near 9. He was flurried. He smelled of rain and horses. He told me I must be ready, that the seal might be broken by morning, but that I must not panic. He said, 'If it happens, Darby, you must go to Holmes. You must go the moment you can.'" Darby spreads his hands helplessly. And then this morning I was no longer in that room. The calmness with which he said it was more disturbing than any melodrama. It suggested not that he was inventing a marvel, but that he had exhausted his astonishment and had passed beyond it into a duller terror. Holmes stopped pacing. "Describe the transition," said he. Darby's eyes shifted, unfocused. As a man looks inward at a memory he would rather not revisit. "I woke," he said slowly. "I was cold. There was a draft stronger than usual. I heard, this is the truth, someone breathing on the other side of the bricks. Not Crownshield's step, not the soft scrape of the shelf. Breathing, as if a man pressed his face to the wall and listened. Then I smelled fresh plaster and something bitter like almonds, perhaps. I sat up. The shelf was already moved." His voice rasped. The bricks were gone. Lestrade's absence left the room strangely private. The rain tapped at the panes. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson moved about with nervous purpose, as if tie trays might ward off catastrophe. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the muscles at his jaw tighten. "Not gone," he corrected softly. "Removed. And replaced later. Proceed." "There was a gap," Darby continued. "Not into your passage, not at first. Into a different room, a larger one, with a window. I crawled through. My hands touched carpet, thick and new. And then," he swallowed. "Then the floor beneath me felt as if it shifted, like a ship turning. It is madness, I know, but I could not keep my balance. I reached for a chair. There was a lamp, and the light was wrong greener. And in the next moment I was in another room entirely. A shop. I smelled ink and leather. I heard a man cough above me. I ran upstairs, and there was Crowninshield dead. Watson, the soldier in me, rebelled against such a tale. Yet Watson the chronicler, who had seen enough of human ingenuity to distrust the boundaries of the possible, held his tongue. Holmes did not reject it. He treated it as one treats a witness who may be mistaken in interpretation but accurate in sensation. "The lamp," said he. "Describe it." Darby blinked. "A glass shade, greenish, like the ones clerks use." Holmes turned away and went to our own table, where his chemical apparatus lay in ordered disorder. He selected a small phial and held it up to the light. "Watson," he said, "what color is this?" "Pale yellow," I answered. "And if I place it under a green shade?" He moved to the lamp, which indeed bore a green glass. The liquid took on a duller hue, its brightness altered. "A change of light changes perception," he said, "not reality. Yet perception governs action, and action is what our enemy counts upon." He set the phial down. "Darby, did you touch anything in Crownshield's room?" "No," Darby said quickly. "I swear it." "Good," said Holmes. "Then you did not contaminate the evidence, which is more than I can say for half the yard." He turned to me. "Watson, you observed the body. What did you not find?" "A wound," said I, "a cause." "Any sign of violence?" Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And that is itself a sign. A man laid out neatly is rarely the result of sudden passion. It is the work of either affection or calculation. Crownshield's trade tells us he inspired little affection, therefore calculation. He went to the window and looked down into Baker Street, though the drizzle made a smear of the view. He dealt in seals, he added, in marks that authenticate, in objects that prove a thing came from a certain hand. And now his own seal has been used to mark my door, and his own room has produced a witness who points back to me. A chain is being forged, Watson, link by link, and each link is made to look antique. A step sounded on the stair outside, quick and heavy. Holmes's head snapped round. The door opened and Lestrade entered, shaking water from his coat like an annoyed terrier. "Got your list," he said, and slapped a notebook down upon the table. "He's had dealings with half the peerage and twice the crooks. But there's one name that stands out." He jabbed at the page. "A Lady Hargreaves came 3 times this month. Paid cash. No receipt. And Crowninshield sent a parcel to her address 2 nights ago. Holmes's eyes met mine. And for the first time that day, I saw in them not merely calculation, but the quick flare of recognition. Lady Hargreaves, he murmured, of Ashdown House. He turned the name over, as if tasting it. And what, Inspector, is Ashdown House most famous for? Lestrade hesitated, annoyed at the question. Never heard of it. Holmes's voice was very quiet. It is famous, said he, for having a sealed room of its own. Holmes's announcement hung in the air with that quiet weight which belongs not to dramatic words, but to truths reluctantly admitted. Lestrade stared at him as if he suspected a trick of rhetoric. Darby's pen halted mid-stroke, and a bead of ink swelled at the nib like a drop of blood. I felt, in my own mind, the sudden linking of 2 distant points Crowninshields, attic room and the red. Wax upon our door, now bridged by the name of a woman and a house I had never seen. Ashdown House. I repeated, "Where is it?" "In Surrey," said Holmes. "An old placeholder than its present owners deserve. It stands upon a rise of ground above a small wood, with a drive that curves so as to conceal the facade until the last moment. A house contrived for impressions. Its present mistress contrives them still." He took Lestrade's notebook and ran his eye down the list. Lady Hargreaves. Married young to a man twice her age, widowed. And now the sort of widow who regards mourning as a costume to be altered according to company. He looked up. And more to the point, she is a collector. Lestrade snorted. Then she buys old junk. That don't make her a murderer. No, said Holmes, with a thin patience, but it makes her a customer. And customers create supply. He turned to Darby. Did Crowninshield ever speak of a lady? A titled client. Darby's face tightened, and for a moment I thought he would refuse. Then he gave a short nod. He called her my patroness once, he said, and he was afraid of her. Not in the way a man fears a creditor. In the way he fears a person who knows the measure of him. His voice lowered. He said she had rooms that should not be opened. Holmes's eyes flashed. There, said he softly. The phrase repeats itself. Sealed rooms multiply like mold when men begin to live double lives. He crossed to the table and pulled a sheet of my writing paper toward him. In a few swift strokes he sketched a rough plan. Our passage door. The hidden chamber beyond. The bricked passage Darby had described. And, beside it, a second, larger rectangle labeled simply, Other House. He held the page so that I might see. If there is a passage into the next building, he said, then our sealed room is not a cul-de-sac. It is a thoroughfare. Someone has used it, Watson, or they would not have dared to restamp the wax. One does not put a fresh lock on a door which no one intends to test. Lestrade leaned over the paper, his practical mind catching at the tangible. So you're saying someone can come and go through your wall and you never knew it? That's a pretty tale, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's smile was brief and mirthless. Inspector, if I had never been wrong, you would have no occupation. Before Lestrade could retort, Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up from below, strained with politeness. Mr. Holmes. There is a gentleman to see you, sir. He says it is very urgent. Holmes did not move from the table. Name. He would not give it, she called, but he has sent up his card. A moment later, the card arrived upon a tray, borne by Mrs. Hudson's trembling hands. Holmes took it, glanced once, and I saw the faintest change in his face, the small tightening at the corners of the eyes which meant surprise quickly mastered. What is it? I asked. He handed it to me. Upon the thick white pasteboard was printed a crest. I did not recognize 3 ravens above a bard held me beneath it. In neat black letters, Mr. Augustus Wexford, Ashdown HOS Lestrade, let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Holmes's gaze went to the sealed door, then back to the card, as if measuring the distance between two traps. "Show him up," he called. Augustus Wexford entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to doors opening before him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a dark coat which had never known a greasy paw. His hair was iron gray at the temples, his mustache trimmed with military precision. Yet his eyes were not military. They were the eyes of a clerk who has risen by caution measuring. Quick to note weakness, slow to expose his own intent. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, with a bow that was correct rather than cordial. "Dr. Watson, Inspector Lestrade." His glance lingered a fraction upon Darby, and in that fraction I read recognition and dislike. "You have the advantage of us, sir," said Holmes, "though you have been kind enough to furnish an address." "I am steward to Lady Hargreaves," Wexford replied, "and I am here because a man is dead and another man has escaped." "Escaped?" Lestrade barked. "He's sitting right there." Wexford did not look at Lestrade. His gaze stayed with Holmes. "Felix Darby was under my lady's protection," he said evenly. "He absconded some months ago with property of considerable value. Mr. Crowninshield was engaged regrettably to assist in recovering it by discreet means. This morning I have learned that Mr. Crowninshield has been murdered. I have also learned that Mr. Darby has been seen in your company. Therefore, I have come to propose an arrangement." Holmes folded his hands. "You propose quickly, Mr. Wexford, for a man who has only learned of these events this morning." Wexford's expression did not flicker. "Bad news travels fast, Mr. Holmes, when it concerns people of position. And what arrangement?" Holmes asked. Wexford produced a small envelope, thick with paper, and placed it upon the table. "Lady Hargreaves will pay you handsomely to return Mr. Darby to Ashdown House and to desist from any further interference. Scotland Yard may do as it pleases, provided the matter does not reach the newspapers." Lestrade surged forward, his face purple. "You can't buy off." Holmes raised a finger, and even Lestrade fell silent. Holmes's eyes were upon the envelope, but his mind was elsewhere. "You wish," said he softly, "to take the witness out of my rooms, away from my scrutiny, and back to a house you admit has used discreet means to recover property. Tell me, Mr. Wexford, what property?" Wexford's mouth tightened for the first time. "A seal," he said at last. Holmes's pupils contracted. "A signet?" "Yes." Holmes's voice was very quiet. "With ravens?" Wexford's glance flicked, against his will, to the crest upon his own card, and I knew the answer before he spoke it. "It is the Hargreaves family seal," he said. "An heirloom." Holmes turned his head a fraction toward me. "Watson," he murmured. "The seal again." Darby's chair scraped. He half rose, his composure at last splintering. "It isn't theirs," he burst out. "Not truly. It was never meant for them. That seal," his voice broke. "It opens things. It closes them. It proves you belong where you don't. And if she has it back—" She opened the room at Ashdown, and Wexford moved with sudden violence, crossing the space in 2 strides. His hand darted, not toward Darby's throat, but toward his inner pocket. Holmes was quicker. In an instant he had seized Wexford's wrist, twisting it upward with a strength that surprised me in one so spare. The steward grimaced, his poise gone. Lestrade sprang forward, triumphant, and in the scuffle a small object fell from Wexford's coat and struck the floor with a metallic click. It was a signet ring, even in the dim light. Its carving was sharp. 3 ravens above a bar. Holmes released Wexford, as if disgusted by touching him, and picked up the ring between finger and thumb. He examined it, turned it, and then held it under our green-shaded lamp. The metal gleamed dully. Upon its inner band, barely visible, was a smear of red. "Wax," said Holmes. He looked at Wexford, and there was something in his expression which made the man's bravado drain away like water through a crack. "You have been to my door," said Holmes. You have stamped crown and shields wax with your lady's ring or one cut from the same pattern. You have attempted to purchase my silence, and you have tried to snatch my witness. Now you will do a fourth thing. Holmes's voice sharpened like a blade. You will take us to Ashdown House today. Lestrade drew a breath to object, but Holmes cut him off. Inspector, you will come as well, he said. If we remain in London, we shall only find more seals upon more doors and more bodies laid out neatly for your men to admire. This game is being played in the country, and it is time we stepped onto the board. Wexford licked his lips. My lady will not receive. Holmes slipped the ring into his pocket with deliberate care. Then she will receive the alternative, he said. A warrant, a scandal, and a charge of accessory to murder. Choose, Mr. Wexford. Will you be a servant or an accomplice? In that moment I understood that the case had passed beyond the cramped attic in Montague Street and beyond the very walls of Baker Street. A sealed room had reached out a long hand, and it was drawing us toward Surrey. Toward a house which, by Holmes's own admission, had a sealed chamber of its own. And I confess that as I watched Holmes's face so calm, so intent, he felt again that peculiar mixture of pride and dread which always accompanied the opening of one of his more dangerous investigations. Holmes's decision once taken, everything in Baker Street moved with the swift economy I had learned to recognize as his battle order. Lestrade, though boiling inwardly at being marched into the country by a consulting detective, nevertheless sent a man to the yard with a brief note for his superiors, and another to fetch a warrant in case polite pressure failed. Wexford, rigid with wounded dignity, went down to secure a carriage. My lady's brougham, he said, as if the upholstery itself were a badge of authority, while Darby remained under my eye. His hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone white. We started within the hour. The journey out of London had that gradual uncurling which always affects one who lives too close to its perpetual tension. The streets widened. The air lost its coal taint. The wet fog broke into a thin, cold light. Yet no release came to my mind, for Holmes sat opposite me in the brougham, long limbs folded, chin sunk, his gaze fixed not on the passing hedges, but upon some inner landscape of facts and possibilities. Twice he drew from his pocket the Hargreaves ring and turned it between finger and thumb, as though the cold metal were a compass needle. Lestrade sat beside him, cramped and silent, and from time to time his eyes strayed to Darby, with the mistrust of an honest man who cannot decide whether his prisoner is victim or villain. Darby spoke once, unprompted, in a low voice that carried despite the clatter of wheels. She will not let you see the room, he said. Not unless she believes you already know what is in it. Holmes did not look up. Then we must arrange, he replied, that she believes precisely that. Darby's laugh was thin. You cannot frighten her with inference, Mr. Holmes. No, said Holmes, and for the first time I heard in him a note of something like satisfaction. But I can frighten her with knowledge. Ashdown House revealed itself exactly as Holmes had described. A long, gray building crouched upon a rise, its windows dark as watchful eyes. The drive curving through bare-limbed trees so that the house seemed to glide into view rather than be approached. It was an old place made heavier by later wealth and extra wing here. A glass conservatory there like fine clothes thrown over an ancestral skeleton. The lawns were winter-browned. The shrubs had been clipped into shapes which looked unnatural in their precision. Even before we reached the steps, I felt that curious sensation one has in certain great houses, that the air itself has been trained to silence. A footman admitted us, and, at Wexford's curt word, ushered us into a morning room whose comfort was designed to suggest effortless taste. A fire blazed. Fresh flowers stood in a porcelain vase. Upon the wall hung a portrait of a stern-faced man in 18th-century dress. his hand resting possessively upon a table where, I noted, a small red sealing wax set had been painted with loving detail. Holmes's gaze lingered there for the briefest moment. Lady Hargreaves entered without haste. She was a tall woman in her early 30s, dressed in mourning, which had been cut to flatter rather than conceal. Her face was pale, her mouth expressive, and her eyes gray and bright-held, that direct, appraising quality which I had seen in women who treat conversation as a game they intend to win. She gave Holmes a smile which contained welcome, amusement, and warning in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "how extraordinary! And Inspector Lestrade, how official? Dr. Watson, I believe. You have brought quite the little deputation to my door." Holmes bowed. "Lady Hargreaves, you are good enough to receive us at short notice." "I am always good enough," she replied lightly, and seated herself so that the firelight warmed her cheek. "Wexford tells me there's been a most unpleasant incident in London. Mr. Crowninshield poor, man dead in his own rooms. And a certain Mr. Darby," her gaze flicked, contemptuous, toward the man by the door, "alive, when he ought to be elsewhere." Darby stiffened, but Holmes spoke before Lestrade could erupt. "You knew Crowninshield well enough to employ him," said he. "You knew Darby well enough to shelter him, and then to hunt him. You know, therefore, more of this matter than you pretend. I shall be direct. Someone used your Seal Your Ring 2 stamp wax upon a door at 221 B Baker Street this morning." Her eyelids lowered a fraction, the only sign that the thrust had landed. "How theatrical," she said. "And do you accuse me of leaving my house in the night to play at waxwork mysteries in Marylebone?" Holmes's voice remained mild. "I accuse you of owning an instrument which has been copied or misused by someone with access to your household. And I accuse you of withholding from the police a material fact that you have a sealed room in this house, and that Mr. Crowninshield was engaged in matters connected with it." Lestrade took a step forward. "Lady Hargreaves," he began. She cut him off with a lift of her hand, not angry, but amused at his presumption. "Inspector, if you wish to arrest me, do so. But I warn you, the Home Office will ask how many peers you have inconvenienced this year, and your answer will not help you." Her gaze returned to Holmes, measuring him anew. "A sealed room," she repeated softly. "You say it as if it is a sin. There are many sealed rooms in England, Mr. Holmes. Some are called nurseries, some are called archives, some are called marriages." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And some are called evidence." For the first time, her smile did not reach her eyes. "Suppose I have such a room," she said. "Suppose my late husband sealed it for reasons of his own. By what right do you demand to see it?" Holmes took the ring from his pocket and placed it on the little table between them. Its metal made a small, final click. "By the right of a dead man laid out neatly," he answered. "By the right of wax, disturbed and restamped. By the right of a witness who crawled from one sealed chamber into another. And by the right, Lady Hargreaves, that the man who stamped my door did not use Crownenshield's worn signet, but a newer cut too sharp at the rim. That means the true seal, the true impression, was here to be copied from." Her gaze went to the ring and lingered there. And in that pause I saw something behind her poise. Not fear of scandal, but fear of what might be opened. "You are very confident," she said at last. Holmes's reply was quiet. "I am very late." Silence fell. The fire popped. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the quarter in a distant hallway, muffled as if even time were asked to tread softly. Then Lady Hargreaves rose. "Come then," she said, and her voice had changed. The lightness was gone. "You shall see my sealed room. But understand this, Mr. Holmes, when you open what has been shut, you do not choose only what steps out. You choose what steps in as well." She moved to the door. Wexford hovered like a shadow at her shoulder, his eyes fixed upon Holmes with a hatred that had become personal. Lestrade looked grimly satisfied. Darby looked as if he might faint. As we followed her from the morning room into a broader corridor hung with dark tapestries, I felt that I was walking not merely through a house, but into the center of a design whose edges had already cut us. At the end of the corridor, she stopped before a door of oak, so old that its grain rose like muscle beneath the varnish. Across its seam ran a strip of red wax. Upon it, stamped twice, were 3 ravens. Lady Hargreaves held out her hand. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "since you are so eager, you may be the one to break it." Holmes stepped forward, his face unreadable, and raised his fingers toward the wax. Holmes's fingers hovered for an instant above the strip of wax, and I solely because I had watched him in moments of extremity before that his hand was not entirely steady. Not with fear, for Holmes did not fear in the ordinary sense, but with that peculiar reluctance a man may feel when he is about to confirm a suspicion. He has kept buried for the sake of his own peace. Lady Hargreaves stood a pace behind him, her face composed, yet her breathing had altered, and there was a faint color high upon her cheekbones, which the corridor's dimness could not conceal. Lestrade shifted his weight like a dog straining at a leash. Darby stared at the door as though it were a gallows. With the point of his penknife, Holmes scored the wax not across the stamp, but along the very edge where it met the wood. "Observe," he said softly to me, "how a seal is always broken by the impatient at its center. The careful man breaks it at the margin, so that the impression may be preserved for later comparison." He lifted the strip away in one piece, and as it came free, there rose, distinct even in that old corridor, the same faint scent I had noted twice already, sandalwood, warm and dry against the damp air of the house. Lady Hargreaves's eyes narrowed. "You enjoy your little theatricals." "I enjoy accuracy," said Holmes, and put the wax into an envelope without looking at her. "Wexford, if you please, the key." The steward's mouth tightened, but he produced a key from his chain and stepped forward. The lock gave with a reluctant click. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Holmes turned the handle and pushed. The room beyond was not a forgotten closet or a disused nursery, as a country house might hide for shame or convenience. It was arranged, curated with the same deliberate taste which had governed the morning room's flowers. A single oil lamp with a green shade stood upon a writing table. The curtains were drawn, though it was day. A Persian rug covered the floor. Along the far wall rose a tall cabinet of dark wood, glass-fronted, its shelves crowded with small objects, signet rings, seals, miniature presses, packets of wax in various colors, and little velvet trays upon which lay the flattened ghosts of impressions. A collector's shrine, I thought. And then I saw the other thing, and my mind corrected itself. It was not a shrine. It was a workshop. At the center of the room, facing the table, stood a chair. Upon that chair sat a man. He sat very straight, his hands upon his thighs, head tilted slightly forward, as if listening. His clothes were those of a gentleman's servant or clerk, good cloth, but worn hard at the elbows. His eyes were open. His lips were parted. Yet the stillness of him had that dreadful completeness which no posture of sleep can imitate. I stepped forward at once. "Dead," I said, after the briefest examination. "And not long." Lestrade's satisfaction vanished. "Another one," he growled. Lady Hargreaves, what the devil! She had gone very pale, though she held herself upright. "That man," she said, and there was genuine astonishment in her voice now, "is not mine. I have never seen him." Holmes had not gone to the body. He had gone to the cabinet. His eyes moved over the shelves in a rapid, hungry sweep. "Not yours," he murmured. "Of course not. He is a message." He opened the cabinet with a deft turn and withdrew a small brass instrument at first glance like a child's toy, but heavier, with a screw mechanism and a narrow channel. He held it up to the light. A seal press for producing impressions with minimal wax, he said. Forgeries made tidy, efficient. He replaced it and took instead a thin packet of paper tied with string. He did not untie it. He merely sniffed. Sandalwood, he said again, and his eyes flicked to Lady Hargreaves. You have been corresponding with someone who scents his paper. Or you have been taught to scent yours. Lady Hargreaves's poise cracked for the first time into anger. You come into my house, accuse me, break my seal, and now you sniff my letters like a mongrel. I demand Holmes cut across her with a sudden, quiet violence of tone. You will demand nothing, madame, until you explain why a man has been placed dead in your private room in the same pose as Silas Crowninshield. Her gaze flickered involuntarily toward the chair. Pose neat, said Holmes. Hands arranged. No struggle. No blood. A death made to look peaceful. He turned at last toward the corpse and knelt, his long fingers moving with the delicacy of a surgeon. He touched the man's collar, lifted the chin, and I saw a faint mark at the side of the throat. No cut. No bruise, but a tiny puncture, almost invisible. Holmes straightened. Not gas, he said softly. A needle. Darby gave a choked sound. They use it, he whispered. In the rooms, quick, quiet. Lestrade seized upon the tangible at last. Needle means poison, he snapped. Watson, you said almonds. I did not, I began, but Holmes silenced me with a glance, for his mind was already racing ahead. He crossed to the writing table, and there, upon the blotter, lay a single folded card, unsealed, as if it had been placed without hurry. He opened it and read. He handed it to me without a word. The message was written in a fine, slanting hand with black ink so dark it seemed wet. Mr. Holmes, you dislike sealed rooms. Yet you keep one. You dislike forged seals. Yet you are marked by one. If you would have the man in the chair remain the last, open what you have refused to open. Bring the Hargreaves seal to the place where your own wax was disturbed. Come alone. Or come too late. There was no signature. Only, pressed faintly into the lower corner, as if with a dry seal upon paper, an impression of 3 ravens. When I looked up, Holmes was watching me with an expression I had never before seen upon his face. Not uncertainty, but a cold, inward reckoning, as if he were measuring the cost of every possible step and finding them all dear. Lady Hargreaves had sunk into a chair by the wall. One gloved hand pressed to her mouth. Wexford stood rigid behind her, but his eyes betrayed him now. They darted again and again to the cabinet, to the dead man, to Holmes as if he feared Holmes would see through him as through glass. Lestrade, his jaw set, looked from the puncture mark to the note like a man who has been mocked by events. Beyond his grasp, Holmes folded the card and put it into his pocket. Then he spoke, and his voice was so controlled that it frightened me more than any outburst could have done. Lady Hargreaves, said he, you have just been made the stage for an argument between myself and an adversary who understands me. Your vanity, your collection, your secrecy, these have been used as the velvet upon which a corpse is laid. He turned his eyes upon Wexford. And someone in this house has permitted it. Wexford's face flushed. That is outrageous, is it? Holmes stepped closer, and I saw Wexford's confidence waver. You came to Baker Street today not merely to retrieve Darby, but to see whether my door had been opened. You knew of the sealed room. You knew of the passage. You also knew Holmes's gaze dropped to the steward's hands, that one may kill with a needle and leave no disorder. Tell me, Mr. Wexford, where is your lady's hypodermic case kept? Wexford's lips parted, and for the first time he had no answer ready. Lestrade made a low sound in his throat and took a half-step forward. Holmes, he muttered, are you saying I am saying nothing yet? Holmes replied. I am listening. In that charged stillness a sound came, so faint that at first I took it for the settling of wood in an old house. Holmes's head lifted. Darby's eyes widened, fixed upon the wall behind the cabinet. A soft scrape brick. Upon brick, followed by a whisper of air, Holmes moved like a released spring. In 2 strides, he was at the cabinet, wrenching it aside with a strength born of urgency. Behind it, half concealed by drapery and paint, was a rectangle of plaster no larger than a man's shoulders. A hairline seam ran around it. Fresh dust lay upon the rug. "The passage," breathed Darby. Holmes ran his fingers along the seam and found, at the lower edge, a tiny hole newly drilled. He put his eye to it for the briefest instant, then straightened, his face set. "Someone is there," he said. "Listening now." And then, before any of us could act, a thin, metallic voice came through the wall as clearly as if a mouth had been pressed to our very ear. "Mr. Holmes," it whispered, "do not be late." The voice ceased. The air seemed to tighten. Holmes's gaze went, not to Lady Hargreaves, nor to Lestrade, but inevitably to the idea of that sealed door in Baker Street which he had refused, again and again, to open. "Watson," he said, very quietly, "we return to London at once." He looked at the dead man in the chair, then at the hidden panel, and finally at Lady Hargreaves, whose eyes were wide and wet with a fear she could no longer dress in wit. "This is no longer a murder investigation," Holmes added. "It is a summons." Holmes insisted we take the evening train, not because speed alone mattered, but because darkness would serve him better than daylight. Lady Hargreaves, shaken into a reluctant compliance, provided the carriage back to the station. Lestrade rode opposite her with the stiff discomfort of an honest man obliged to accept aristocratic assistance. Wexford sat with his shoulders braced, eyes fixed ahead, the very picture of offended loyalty. Yet I saw the pulse in his neck jump whenever Holmes shifted his gaze toward him. Darby rode beside me, silent now, his earlier agitation condensed into a watchfulness so intense that it seemed to tighten the air within the coach. We reached Baker Street after nightfall. The fog had returned, thicker than before, and the gas lamps made of it a yellow broth through which shadows drifted like slow fish. Holmes did not go at once upstairs. He halted at the foot of the steps and stood very still, head slightly inclined, as if the street itself were speaking in a language only he could hear. Then he went up, 2 steps at a time, and we followed. Lestrade puffing and cursing softly under his breath. In our sitting room, the fire had burned low. Mrs. Hudson had left a lamp lit, and the green shade threw its familiar tint over the table where Darby's written inventory still lay. Yet something had changed. I felt it before I could name it. A faint displacement, as when a book has been returned to a shelf, but not quite true, or when a picture hangs a fraction crooked. Holmes felt it too. His eyes moved once, rapidly. Over every object, the violin case, the coal scuttle. The papers then came to rest on the sealed door in the passage. The wax was no longer intact. It had not been torn away in one strip, as Holmes had done at Ashdown, nor scored at the edge with care. It was cracked through the stamp itself, and the fragments had been pressed back into place, as if by a hand that wished to conceal the act, but lacked patience for finesse. A thin red line ran down the wood like a fresh wound. Lestrade swore. "They've been in." Holmes held up a hand, not to silence him, but to steady the room. "Not they, Inspector," he said. "One, and not to search. To remind." Darby made a small sound behind me. "It's open," he whispered, and there was in his voice the awe of a man looking at a grave disturbed. Holmes did not touch the handle. He knelt again, lamp in hand, and examined the wax fragments. "Same ravens," he murmured, but pressed harder. Anger. He shifted the lamp and leaned closer to the keyhole. The brass around it bore a faint smudge. He touched it with the tip of his finger and brought it to his nose. "Oil," he said. "A locksmith's oil, not household." Whoever came expected resistance. Lestrade pushed forward. "Then we open it and take him, whoever he is." Holmes rose very slowly. "Inspector," he said, "if we open it like a pantry, we will find whatever he wishes us to find. If we open it like a battlefield, we may survive the opening." His eyes flicked to me. "Watson, stand at the window. Watch the street. If any man pauses longer than a heartbeat, tell me." Then to Lestrade, "You will stand here by the mantel. Pistol ready, but do not fire unless I say so." And to Darby, whose face had taken on a gray hue, "You will sit, Mr. Darby, and you will keep your hands where I can see them. Whatever is beyond that door, you have lived with it longer than I have, but you will not run toward it." Wexford had lingered in the sitting-room doorway like a man uncertain whether to flee or to witness history. Holmes's glance caught him. "And you," said Holmes softly, "will come closer. If this concerns your lady's seal and your lady's secrets, then you will not shelter behind her skirts now." The steward flushed, but obeyed. Stepping into the lamplight with the rigid obedience of one compelled by forces he despised, Holmes went to the sideboard and took from it a small glass tumbler. He crossed to the sealed door, set the tumbler upon the floor close to the seam, and then, with the delicacy of a man tuning an instrument, placed the flat of his ear against the wood. For a long moment there was nothing but the faint crackle of the dying fire and the distant, muffled rumble of London. Then I heard it too, a soft, rhythmic tap, as if someone on the other side were touching brick with a fingernail. Holmes's face hardened. He straightened, drew his penknife, and slipped its blade into the crack where wax had already been broken. He did not force, he coaxed. The door gave a fraction, and from the gap there came a breath of air cold, damp, smelling of plaster and sandalwood and something else. Something metallic, which reminded me of blood on a surgeon's hands. Gas. Lestrade muttered. Holmes shook his head. "No hiss," he said, "but keep back." He took a match, struck it, and held it near the gap. The flame burned steady. "No suffocation," he murmured. "Good." Then, with sudden decision, he threw the door wide. The room beyond was exactly as Darby had described below. Narrow, whitewashed, long ago, now stained with age. The iron bedstead stood against the wall. The shelf had been moved aside, revealing a rough opening behind it, where bricks had indeed been disturbed. But it was not empty. Upon the bed lay an object wrapped in oilcloth. Tied with string, Holmes approached it with that odd mixture of impatience and caution which belongs only to him. He did not touch it at once. He looked instead at the floor. There were footprints in the dust two-sets, one heavier, with a worn heel, the other lighter, narrower, as of a man who walked carefully, perhaps with a limp. The lighter prints went to the bed and back. The heavier prints, Holmes's eyes, narrow, did not enter far. They stopped at the threshold, as if someone had stood there watching. "Two men," Holmes said. "One delivers. One oversees." He turned his head slightly. "Wexford. Those narrow prints-ear boots are too well kept. Lestrade's are too broad. Darby sits still. Watson, I believe we have just been visited by the same hand that placed the man in Lady Hargreaves's chair." I moved closer, revolver in my pocket, my mind racing with the implications. Holmes at last cut the string. The oilcloth fell away to reveal a wooden box no larger than a Bible. Its lid was fitted tight, and on its top, pressed into a smear of red wax, was an impression 3 ravens. Holmes's fingers paused upon the lid. "A gift," he murmured, "or a taunt." Then he opened it. Inside lay a stack of letters, bound in ribbon, and beneath them a small cloth pouch. Holmes lifted the pouch, weighed it, and poured its contents into his palm. A signet ring dropped into the light tanty gold. The ravens worn at the edges by generations of use. "The real seal," Holmes said quietly. "Lady Hargreaves's ring, true. Not copied, had been in our sealed room all along." Behind me, Wexford made a sound like a man struck. "That's impossible," he whispered. My Lady Holmes's eyes did not leave the ring. "Your lady has been collecting," he said, "but she has not been holding the collection." He picked up the letters and, without opening them, inhaled once. "Sandalwood," he said. "And the ink iron gall. Old-fashioned, deliberate." He glanced toward Lestrade. "Inspector, we have been offered a bargain. Silence in exchange for fear. And we have been given the key to the bargain." His gaze shifted to me, and I saw in it the cold clarity that always came before his most dangerous moves. "Watson, the man who whispers through walls, has just placed his hand on my past. Now I shall place mine on his present." From the street below came a faint whistled 2 notes, then one thin as a thread, yet unmistakably intentional. Holmes froze. Lestrade's pistol came up. I moved to the window and parted the curtain a hair's breadth. A figure stood across the street in the fog, just within the halo of a lamp, looking up at our windows as if he knew precisely where we were. He raised a gloved hand, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture almost courteous, and then stepped backward into the mist and was gone. Holmes let the curtain fall from my fingers. "He knows we have opened it," I said. Holmes closed the box with a soft click, as if sealing a decision. "No," he replied. "He has known all along. The question, my dear Watson, is whether he believes we will do what he expects." And as he spoke, he slipped the raven's ring onto his own finger. Holmes had no vanity in his triumphs. Yet there are moments when even his austere temperament admits a certain dramatic instinct. When he slipped the raven's ring upon his finger, it was not with the flourish of a conjurer, but with the cold finality of a man accepting a mark that had been forced upon him man-choosing. In that same instant, to make it serve his own design. Lestrade began to protest, half in outrage, half in superstition, for the thing seemed to him a gesture of complicity. But Holmes silenced him with a glance and turned to the letters in the wooden box, as calmly as if he had been invited to examine a client's will. "Watson," said he, "you will read while I think." He handed me the ribboned packet and drew the green-shaded lamp nearer, so that its light lay upon the paper like an unnatural pool. The first letter crackled as I broke the old fold. The scent of sandalwood rose again, steady and deliberate, and with it a faint taint of something chemical, as if the writer had handled reagents before he handled ink. The handwriting was fine, slanted, and controlled to the point of cruelty, every stroke a decision. The letter was addressed to no one, as though it presumed its reader. It spoke of rooms men build to keep themselves whole, and of seals men use to prove their innocence, and it returned, again and again, to a single assertion that a man may be imprisoned by what he refuses to name. I confess I felt, as I read, that I was looking not at correspondence, but at an anatomy someone had laid open. Holmes's private history and labeled the nerves. At the bottom of the page was pressed the same dry impression of 3 ravens, so faint that it could only have been made with a seal applied to paper without wax. Holmes did not ask what it said. He watched my face as I read, and he read that instead. When I finished, he held out his hand for the next sheet, and I passed it over like a man delivering evidence at a trial. The second letter was shorter and more practical. It named an hour midnight stand, a place, Montague Street. Above the shop, in the attic room where Crowninshield had been laid out and Felix Darby had waited. "Bring the true seal," it commanded, "and bring the false one, if you can find it." Then, in a line that made my throat tighten, it added, "Bring your doctor. If you value your own steadiness," was signed with no name, only the ravens again. And beside them a tiny penciled mark, A circle bisected by a vertical line. Like the crude diagram of a door viewed from above, left, ESTRADE. Leaning over my shoulder, struck the table with his fist. "It's blackmail," he cried. "It's a trap, Mr. Holmes." Holmes, who had been turning the ring slowly on his finger, as if feeling for a catch beneath the metal, looked up with a faint smile. "Yes," said he, "and therefore it is also an opportunity." He rose, crossed to the mantel, and took up the violin case he had left unopened that morning. From it he did not draw the violin, but a narrow leather roll. He unfastened it and revealed a set of small tool-slot picks, wires, a tiny gimlet, and a slender instrument like a surgeon's probe. Lestrade's eyebrows climbed. "So you were keeping secrets," he muttered. Holmes's expression did not change. "Inspector," said he, "I keep solutions." Darby had been silent, staring at the sealed door as though expecting it to speak again. Now he found his voice. "He won't meet you there," he said. "Not truly. He'll make you think you've met him." And then his eyes flicked to the inner passage beyond the shelf, the bricked seam that led into the neighboring house. "Then he'll vanish, the way I vanished." Holmes's gaze sharpened on him. "Precisely why," he replied. "We will not enter that attic room as men who arrive by stairs alone." He turned to Lestrade. "You will place 2 plainclothes men in Montague Street by 10 o'clock, one at the shop front, one in the alley behind. No uniforms, no crowd. Our correspondent thrives on spectacle." Lestrade bristled at being commanded in his own sphere. Yet the logic bit deep, and he nodded. Holmes then drew me aside, nearer the window. "Watson," he said in a lower tone, "the point is not to catch him in the attic. The point is to learn how he moves between sealed spaces. Crownshield's room, my room, Lady Hargreaves's room 3 nodes. Someone is using architecture the way a forger uses paper." He tapped the raven's ring lightly against the glass, a faint click that made me think of the signet striking wax. "This ring is the key he chose to give us. That means he expects me to use it. And whenever a man expects Holmes to do a thing, Holmes must consider doing the opposite." Even as he spoke, he took up my hat and coat and began to dress with brisk precision. The act of preparing steadied him. I have observed before that Holmes can endure almost anything so long as it may be treated as a problem of action. Yet in the brief instant when he fastened his collar, I saw his eyes flickingly once toward the now unsealed door in our passage, and in that glance there was a depth of memory which no words would have served. We went out into the fog like men stepping into water. Holmes did not take a cab. He walked, keeping to the darker side of the street, using the lamplight as a fisherman uses the ripple of a stream. Twice he turned suddenly into side passages and once into a mews. Each time he paused, listening, then resumed. At last he stopped beneath a lamp and held up his hand. Across the street, half lost in mist, a figure moved, then paused, then moved again. It was not the courteous man who had tipped his hat earlier, but someone smaller, hunched, with the gait of a laborer. Yet the pause was too measured, the interest too direct. Holmes murmured without looking at me, "Our overseer has returned." We followed at a distance, never closing, never losing. The figure led us not toward Montague Street, as any straightforward pursuit would, but toward the river, through lanes that grew narrower and fouler, until the air smelled of damp rope and refuse. At last the man slipped through a gap between 2 warehouses and Holmes, with a sudden burst of speed, darted after him. I followed, revolver drawn, my boots splashing through black puddles. The gap opened into a small yard. There was no man. Only a wall of brick and a heavy door bound with iron. Holmes crossed to the door and examined its lock. Upon the keyhole was smeared a trace of red so faint one might take it for rust. "Wax," Holmes whispered. "He has been stamping more than paper." Lestrade's voice came from behind. harsh with breath and effort, for he had followed as best he could. "Where is he, then?" Holmes did not answer at once. He placed his palm flat upon the iron-bound door, as he had done upon the sealed door at Baker Street, and his face became intent, listening not for sound, but for the idea of it. Then he looked at me, and the old excitement, the perilous joy of the chase lit his eyes. "He is not fleeing," said Holmes. "He is positioning." He lifted the raven's ring, as if it were a token in a ritual, and added, very softly, "And he means us to open the next door for him." At that instant, from somewhere within the warehouse, there came a single tap, faint, metallic, patient like a fingernail upon brick. Holmes did not answer Lestrade's question. He did not even look at him. His attention was fixed upon that patient tapping from within the warehouse, as a physician's is fixed upon a pulse that has changed its rhythm. He drew me a pace aside into the deeper shadow of the yard and spoke under his breath. "There is a man in there, Watson, but the more important thing is the door. It is not meant to keep us out. It is meant to make us go in by the one entrance our adversary can predict." "Then we do not oblige him," I whispered. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Just so." He turned, and in a few swift movements brought out from his pocket the slim leather roll of tools. He selected a short wire and a tiny gimlet, and knelt by the jamb where brick met iron. The drizzle had made the mortar soft enough to take a mark. He pressed the gimlet gently, not to bore through, but to test. "Hollow," he murmured. "A service cavity common in these warehouses, and there is warm air behind it." He held the tumbler brought with him as if it were as natural as a pistol close to the brick. The faintest tremor quivered on its rim. "Someone is moving," he said. Lestrade, his patience frayed, raised his hand to hammer on the iron. Holmes caught his wrist without looking, and the grip was like a vice. "If you knock," said Holmes quietly, "you will announce that you are a policeman. And the man inside will either run or worse die on cue. Our correspondent has already shown us how neatly he can arrange a corpse." Lestrade swallowed his retort. "Then what do we do?" he demanded. Holmes rose and looked up. Above the iron-bound door was a narrow loading hatch, its shutters closed, the pulley rope hanging limp. The brickwork beside it was dark with soot. Holmes's gaze traveled over it, measuring. "We borrow the building's own habits," he said. "Watson, give me your hand." He climbed with astonishing agility, placing his foot upon a protruding brick, his fingers upon the iron strapwork, until he reached the hatch. With my arm braced beneath his boot for a final lift, he got his fingertips beneath the shutter edge and eased it open a crack. A warm, stale breath came out, carrying with it the smell of hemp, tar, and faintly sandalwood. Holmes's head turned slightly. "There's your scent again," he murmured. He slipped through the hatch as a cat slips through a hedge, and in a moment his boots vanished into darkness. I followed as best I could, less graceful, my heart hammering with the old mixture of excitement and dread. Lestrade cursed and began to climb after, making enough noise for 3 men. But we had no leisure to correct him. Within was a broad space, stacked with crates and bales. A single lantern burned on the floor, turned low. It threw a sickly circle of light and left the rafters in blackness. The tapping had ceased. The silence that followed felt intentional, like a held breath. Holmes stood motionless a moment, and I could see only the pale oval of his face and the glint of the raven's ring as he raised his hand. Then a voice spoke from somewhere among the crates, close yet unseen. It was the same thin metallic whisper we had heard behind the cabinet at Ashdown House. A voice that seemed made less by lungs than by will. "You have brought the seal, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's reply was mild. "I have brought more than you asked for." A low chuckle came from the dark. "Your doctor, then, and your yard dog. How loyal." Lestrade sprang forward, lantern raised. "Show yourself." He barked. The whisper answered from a different angle at once, as if the speaker had moved without sound. I am showing you precisely what I wish you to see. Holmes took one slow step, and his gaze, instead of hunting the shadows, went straight to a particular crate near the far wall. Its lid was new, its nails too bright. "Watson," he said, "do you notice what is absent?" I stared, my mind racing through the clutter. "Dust," I said suddenly. "That crate is too clean." "Exactly." Holmes crossed to it and placed his palm upon the lid. The wood was slightly warm. He did not open it. He went to the side, crouched, and with the thin wire, slid something out from beneath a scrap of paper, folded tight, held in place by a dab of red wax. He opened it and read by lantern light. His face did not change, but his voice, when he spoke, was very soft. "A second summons," he said. "He is tightening the cord." I caught a glimpse of the message as Holmes handed it to me. It contained only 3 lines. "The attic at Montague Street is bait. The sealed room at Baker Street is the hook. Midnight. Open it and let him step out as I read." A sound came from within, the clean crate not tapping now, but a faint scratch, as of fingernails against wood. Lestrade's eyes widened. He reached for the lid. Holmes caught his sleeve. "No," he snapped, and there was command in it. "If you open that, Inspector, you will give our enemy exactly what he wants: a spectacle, a corpse, and a simple culprit to hang it on." The whisper returned, nearer than before. So wise, so late. Holmes's head lifted. "You placed a living man in Lady Hargreaves' sealed room and killed him with a needle," he said evenly. "You laid out crown and shield as if for burial. Now you place another man in a box. You do enjoy your arrangements." "You understand arrangements," said the voice. "You arranged a room in your own home and called it sealed. You arranged a man inside it and called him safe. You arranged your conscience around the word necessary for the first time." I saw Holmes's composure tighten at the edges. "Not break never, that but draw taut. Like wire." "You are speaking of Darby," said Holmes. "I am speaking of you," replied the whisper. Holmes stepped back from the crate and turned, his face slightly so that the lantern caught the raven's ring. "Then let us speak of me in the proper place," he said. "At Baker Street. At midnight? You wish me to open my door. Very well. But understand this, when I open it, I shall not be alone." The whisper laughed softly. "You will be alone, Mr. Holmes. You always are, when it matters." A sudden movement stirred the darkness to our left, a shadow slipping between stacked bales. I raised my revolver, but Holmes seized my wrist and forced it down. "No shooting," he hissed. "He wants noise." Lestrade lunged, and his boots crashed against a crate. The lantern swung, throwing wild shapes across the walls. In that instant, I saw, for the briefest heartbeat, a face at a narrow gap between boxes, pale, sharp-nosed, eyes bright with an odd mirth. It vanished at once, as if the darkness had swallowed it. Holmes did not pursue. He bent, picked up the dab of broken wax from the note's fold, and held it to the light. "To crisp," he murmured. "A new cut again." He slipped it into his pocket. "Watson, we leave." Lestrade stared at him in disbelief. "Leave a man in a box." Holmes's voice was iron. "We will not play his scene. Inspector, have your men surround this warehouse in silence and wait. If there is a man inside that crate, he will be alive only so long as we refuse the melodrama. Get a saw, not an axe. Get a doctor, not a constable, and do it quietly." He turned to me as we climbed back toward the hatch. "Now," he said, and for the first time that night I heard an emotion he did not bother to mask. "We go home and do what I swore I would not do." We reached Baker Street, with the city's clocks beginning to lean toward midnight. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her face white. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, there's been a tapping again, sir." In the passage, and a gentleman's voice, very soft, like he was praying. Holmes went straight to the sealed door. The broken wax clung to it like scabbed blood. He placed his hand upon the handle and held it there, listening. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, from the other side, so faint that one might think it imagination, came a single, polite rap, 2 taps, and 1. Holmes looked at me. In his eyes there was no longer only the chase, but the grave acceptance of a man entering a room in his own mind that he has kept barred for years. "Watson," he said, "whatever steps out when I open this door, you must remember one thing. It is stepping out because it was invited." And with that, he began to turn the handle. Holmes turned the handle with an even pressure, neither hurried nor hesitant, as though he wished the mechanism itself to have no cause for complaint. The latch lifted without protest. Yet the moment the door began to swing inward, a thin breath of air slid out, stale, damp, and edged with that persistent sandalwood, now so familiar that it seemed less a scent than a signature. I found my throat tighten, and my hand went of itself toward the revolver in my pocket. Not from any clear expectation of attack, but because the human body, when faced with the unknown, clings to the comfort of habit. The room beyond lay in darkness at first, for Holmes had turned down the passage lamp earlier, and the opening admitted only a narrow blade of greenish light from the sitting room. It fell across the iron bedstead, the bare boards, the shelf drawn aside. The bricked seam behind the shelf was not bricked now. It yawned open like a wound, and from it came the faintest sound, a slow, deliberate exhalation. Holmes stepped inside. I would have followed at once, but he lifted his hand without turning, a gesture so slight that no one but I would have heeded it. In that instant I understood. He wished me to remain on the threshold, to be his witness and his guard, but not to spoil whatever arrangement had been made within by trampling it with my boots. I held myself rigid, every nerve straining forward. A man sat upon the edge of the bed. He was not Felix Darby, nor Wexford, nor any figure Lestrade had described to us. He was older, perhaps 50 yet, with the wiry leanness of one who has lived on alertness rather than comfort. His clothes were plain but good, the sort a discreet professional might wear to pass through any district without remark. His hair was dark, brushed back with gray at the temples. A small pince-nez sat low upon his nose, giving him the appearance, in that dim slice of light, of a scholarly gentleman. But his eyes, those were the betrayal. They had the brightness of someone who does not merely observe, but enjoys observing. They were amused, and in that amusement there was contempt. He rose as Holmes entered. Not quickly, but with the careful grace of a man who will not be hurried even by danger. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly. At last, Holmes did not answer at once. His gaze moved, swift as a blade, over the floor, the bed, the opening in the wall, the dust. Then it returned to the man's hands. They were empty. No weapon showed. Yet the fingers were stained faintly near the nail bed's ink, and something else, darker, as though he had handled wax and metal. I saw Holmes's pupils contract, the smallest sign of a mind-finding purchase. "You have come through my wall," said Holmes at last. "You have killed 2 men and placed a third as a warning. You have stamped seals you did not own and stolen one you did. Now you sit in my sealed room as if it were a club chair. Who are you?" The man smiled. "You dislike names," he murmured. "They make things too easy. But since you insist, you may call me Mr. Vale." "A convenient name," said Holmes. "A convenient life," replied Vale, and his eyes flicked past Holmes to me in the doorway. "And you have brought your doctor." "As I advised. How very obedient." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Obedient? No, careful. A distinction you ought to respect." Vale gave a small shrug, as if distinctions were luxuries. Then let us be careful together. I did not bring you here to trade insults. I brought you here to open what you have kept shut. The room, yes, but more than the room. Holmes's hand moved, and for the first time I noticed that the raven's ring was no longer on his finger. He held it now between thumb and forefinger, catching the light. You wanted this, said Holmes. The true seal. I wanted you to wear it, said Vale simply. Because seals do not merely close letters, Mr. Holmes. They close minds. They close mouths. They close histories. His smile widened a fraction. And you, above all men, have been sealed. Holmes's face might have been carved from stone, but his voice came lower. You speak as if you know my history. I know the part you hid in brick, Vale answered. I know the part you trusted to Crown and Shield. I know the part you trusted foolishly to the idea that a promise can outlast necessity. At the mention of Crown and Shield, Holmes's composure tightened. Why kill him? He demanded. Vale's expression turned almost thoughtful. Because he began to believe he could bargain with me, he said. He imagined that because he collected seals, he could collect leverage. He was wrong. His gaze slid to the open passage in the wall. I needed him to die neatly. A vulgar death would have brought vulgar attention. Neatness, you see, is a language. It says, this is not passion. This is policy. And the man in Lady Hargreaves's chair. I could not keep silence. And the one in the crate. Vale looked toward me again, mildly pleased. A demonstration, he said. If you wish men to do as you intend, Doctor, you show them the consequence of refusal. Mr. Holmes has shown such consequences to others his entire career. I merely returned the courtesy. Holmes took one step nearer. What do you want? He asked. Vale's eyes gleamed. The thing you sealed, he said. The papers. The proof. The original impression, if you like. The truth of why this room exists at all. Holmes did not deny it. That was what chilled me most. He stood in the narrow darkness as if weighing whether the act of speaking would cost more than the act of silence. At last he said, each word measured, you will not have it. Vale sighed, as though disappointed but not surprised. Then I shall take it, he replied. And you will help me without realizing you have done so. Holmes's gaze flicked to the floor. I followed it, and then I saw what he had seen. In the dust near the threshold, a fine line, almost invisibly thread of wire. No thicker than a hair, running from the door jamb to the shelf. A tripline. A trigger. Not to explode, perhaps, but to signal, to release, to lock. Holmes had avoided it by instinct and experience. But Lestrade, who had remained in the sitting room by Holmes's command, had not yet blundered in. I understood then why Holmes had checked him. One wrong step, and the sealed room would have sealed again. With us inside, Holmes smiled suddenly, and it was the most frightening smile I had ever seen on his face. Not mirth, but the expression of a man who has decided to burn a bridge while standing upon it. You are clever, Mr. Vale, said he, but you are not singular. Vale's brows rose. Oh, Holmes's hand moved like lightning. He flung the raven's ring, not at Vale's face, but into the open passage behind the shelf. It struck brick with a sharp clink and vanished into darkness beyond, as if tossed down a well. For the first time, Vale's composure broke. He sprang toward the opening with a hissed oath. And in that instant, I saw the truth of him. Not a gentleman at all, but a man whose self-control was a garment worn for effect. Holmes moved with the same speed, not to pursue, but to seize the shelf and shove it hard into place, blocking the gap. The hidden cavity boomed with the sound of wood against brick. Vale whirled, eyes bright with sudden fury. You idiot, he snarled. Do you know what you've done? Holmes's voice was ice. I have removed your certainty, he said. Now you must act like every other criminal in London without perfect information." Vale's hand darted into his coat. I drew my revolver in the same heartbeat. "Holmes!" I cried. Vale froze, his fingers half within the pocket, and his eyes slid to the pistol barrel pointed at his chest. In that pause, Holmes stepped aside deliberately so that Vale had no clear line past him to the doorway, and no clear line to the wall. The room suddenly was a cage. "You came for what I sealed," Holmes said. "Very well. Here is the bargain you believe you have earned. You will tell me your true name, your employer, and what you intended to do with the Hargreaves seal. If you refuse, you will not leave this room alive." Vale laughed softly, but it held no humor. "You are bluffing," he said. "No," said Holmes, "and I heard the truth in it. He is not." Vale's gaze flicked to me again, weighing. Then, astonishingly, he relaxed a fraction. "Very well," he said. "Not my name, Mr. Holmes. Names are for graves. But I will give you the motive, because you cannot solve without it." He leaned slightly forward, voice dropping. "There is a document, Mr. Holmes, older than Lady Hargreaves, older than Crowninshield, older than your friendship with your doctor. A document sealed with those ravens. It proves a transfer of title that never should have occurred. It would ruin a family and elevate another. It would open Parliament's doors. It would close yours." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "So it is inheritance," he said. "Land and legitimacy." Vale's smile returned, thin and deadly. "It is England," he corrected. "And England is nothing but seals on paper." From the sitting room came a sudden crash lestrade, unmistakably overturning something in his attempt to come to us at last. The tripwire on the floor trembled where it lay, and I saw Vale's eyes drop to it with quick calculation. Holmes saw it too. He moved like a man diving, seized the wire between finger and thumb, and snapped it. A faint click answered from somewhere within the wall, as if a mechanism had been armed and then denied. Vale's face changed rage, then admiration. "You really are intolerable," he whispered. Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "And you," said he, "are now caught in a room you thought you could command." Outside, the city's clocks began to strike midnight, their muffled notes bleeding through brick and plaster. The sealed room, opened at last, had not yielded a ghost. It had yielded a man-hand with him, the first clear outline of a conspiracy whose reach went far beyond Montague Street and Ashdown House. Vale lifted his hands very slowly from his coat, showing them empty. "Shall we continue?" he said softly. "Or shall we see which of us has arranged the better ending?" And in that question, I felt the case tilt toward its final, dreadful clarity. Holmes did not answer Vale's question at once. He stood with the broken tripwire pinched between finger and thumb, as if the thin metal were the last thread binding the night to reason. Vale, hands half raised, watched him with that bright, disdainful patience which belongs to men who have wagered everything upon their understanding of another's character. I kept my revolver level, my eyes shifting between the stranger's coat pocket and the shadowed corners of the low room. "You are correct in one respect," said Holmes at last. "The ending has been arranged, but not, I think, by the hand you imagine." Vale's lips twitched. "Still speaking in riddles. Very well. We shall see whose arrangement holds." Holmes stepped sideways with exquisite care, placing his boot where the dust was undisturbed, and reached behind him for the shelf. He moved it not fully back over the opening, but just enough to leave a narrow slit through which a man might not pass, yet through which sound could travel. Then, with a swift motion, he picked up the lamp from the passage and lowered it, so that its light fell under the shelf's edge and into the cavity beyond. The glow revealed brick, mortar, and at the far side something that made my blood run cold. A second strip of wax, fresh and glossy. pressed along a seam in the brickwork as if the wall itself had been sealed from within. Vale's eyes widened, and the first true fear I had seen in him flickered across his face. "No," he whispered. Holmes's voice was like steel. "Yes, someone has sealed your escape route while you were busy sealing mine." A sound came then from the sitting room, Lestrade's heavy footfalls, his breath harsh with haste. He had found the courage to disregard Holmes's earlier command and was coming through, blundering as an honest man blunders when secrecy offends him. Holmes did not turn his head. "Inspector," he called, "stop where you are. One pace further, and you may close us in here." Lestrade's shape filled the doorway, pistol up, eyes wide at the sight of Vale. "I've got him," he rasped. Holmes's gaze never left the waxed seam in the brick. "No," he corrected. "We have him, which is not the same thing." Vale chose that instant to act. His hand darted, not for a pistol, but for something smaller and more subtle. A thin glint flashed between his fingers, needle-bright tanned. He sprang toward Holmes with a speed that belied his age. I fired without thinking. The shot in that low room was monstrous. It cracked like a cannon in a tunnel. The bullet struck the plaster above Vale's shoulder, showering dust. Vale staggered back, not hit, but shocked by the sudden violence of it. Holmes, moving faster than my mind could follow, brought up the lamp and flung its green-shaded glow full into Vale's eyes. Light, I learned then, can be a weapon. Vale flinched, blinded. And in that fraction of disorientation, Holmes struck his wrist with the edge of his hand. The small object clattered to the boards. I saw it clearly as it rolled. A slender glass ampule fitted into a brass sleeve, an injector no larger than a fountain pen. Holmes pinned Vale's arm, twisted, and with the same motion drove him back against the bedstead. The iron frame rang. Vale's head snapped up, his eyes watering. "You would needle me as you did the others," said Holmes softly. "You are consistent, Mr. Vale. That is why you are catchable." Lestrade surged forward, fumbling for his cuffs. "Not yet," Holmes snapped. "Look there." He pointed with his chin toward the bricked passage. The fresh wax seam trembled just perceptibly like skin over muscle. Then came the faint scrape we had heard at Ashdown House, brick on brick. The stealthy sound of a man working in darkness with a tool and a plan. The unseen presence had not fled. It had come closer. Vale's composure returned in a distorted, desperate way. He began to laugh. "Do you hear it?" he panted. "That is my arrangement toward yours. Either way, Holmes, you cannot stop the door opening. You cannot stop someone stepping out." Holmes's face was pale in the lamplight. "You misunderstand," he said. "I can stop it. I merely must choose how ugly I am willing to be." He bent, snatched up the fallen injector, and examined it with a glance that took in make, residue, and purpose. Then he thrust it into Lestrade's hand. "Take that as evidence. If you lose it, Inspector, I shall have you transferred to guarding pigeons." Lestrade blinked, but closed his fist around it. Holmes went to the fireplace in the sitting room, seized the poker, and returned. Without hesitation, he drove the poker's point into the fresh wax seam inside the cavity beyond the shelf, chipping mortar. A breath of colder air burst through, and with it the full force of sandalwood, so heavy it was almost cloying. The seam gave. Something inside shifted, and suddenly a section of brickwork, congeniously cut, moved inward a hair's breadth. Like a door beginning to yield dot from the darkness beyond came a soft, approving whisper. At last, I saw Holmes's jaw clench. He did not answer the voice. Instead, he thrust the poker deeper and levered with a strength that made the iron bedstead groan. The disguised panel gave way with a low crack, and a narrow gap opened enough for a hand. Perhaps a face. A face appeared, not the sharp-nosed man I had glimpsed in the warehouse. but another, younger, smooth, almost boyish, with eyes to calm for any honest labor. His mouth curved into something that might have been called a smile, had it not been so empty of warmth. He looked straight at Holmes, as if the wall were merely a curtain between stages. "You broke the seal," he said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you made it," he replied. "Tell me your name." The young man's gaze drifted to Vale, held now by Lestrade, and something like contempt passed over his features. "Names are for the arrested," he said. "He is already done." Vale jerked against Lestrade's grip, rage and terror mingling. "You promised," he began. The young man's smile sharpened. "I promised you an opening," he said. "I did not promise you a way out." Holmes moved like lightning. He seized Vale by the collar and dragged him toward the gap, forcing him to face the young man. "You know him," Holmes said. "Who is he?" Vale's breathing came in sobbing pulls. He choked. "He is the hand behind the seal. The one Crown and Shield feared. The one who a thin click came from the young man's side of the gap. A dart so small it was a glimmer shot through and struck Vale at the base of the neck. Vale stiffened at once, his eyes wide, his mouth opening soundlessly. Lestrade swore and caught him as he sagged. I sprang forward, fingers at Vale's pulse. "Alive," I said urgently, but failing fast. Holmes's face went white with a cold fury I had rarely witnessed. He lunged for the gap, but the young man was already withdrawing. And the panel, released, began to fall back into place under its own weight. Holmes slammed his shoulder against it, fighting the closing wall as one might fight a living thing. The bricks shuddered. For a moment the gap held, and through it the young man's voice came. Soft as ever, almost kind. "Mr. Holmes," it said, "you wanted to know what was in your sealed room. It was not papers. It was a habit. A method. A man like you, but without your restraints." Then the panel dropped. The seam vanished. The corridor beyond became again a wall. Holmes stood, breathing hard, his hand flat against the brick, as if he could force it to confess. Lestrade knelt over Vale, shouting for water, for help, for anything. I had already loosened Vale's collar and was searching for the dart, but it was so fine that it might have been swallowed by flesh. Darby, in the doorway, looked as if he had seen his own future. Holmes turned at last. Hand in his eyes, I saw not triumph, but a grim comprehension settling into place. "The letters," he said to me, abrupt. "The inheritance document he spoke of. It was misdirection. This was never about land alone. Then what?" I demanded, my hands sticky with the sweat of a dying man. Holmes's gaze went to the broken wax on the floor, to the ravens on the envelope, to the brick seemed now innocent again. "It is about authentication," he said. "About making a lie look older than the truth. About sealing a new power with an old mark. And above all, Watson, about proving that every door can be opened, even mine." From below, Mrs. Hudson's frightened voice rose faintly. "Mr. Holmes, sir, there's a constable at the door. He says there's been a death at Montague Street. Another man in a chair. Neatly done." Holmes closed his eyes for a brief instant, as if the news were a weight he had expected and yet must bear anew. Then he opened them, and the old terrible calm returned. "Inspector," he said, "you will have your arrest. But you will not have your mastermind, not tonight." He glanced at the sealed wall one last time. "He has stepped out, and he has stepped away. We have only what he permitted us to keep." Lestrade's face contorted with frustration. "And what's that?" Holmes looked down at Vale, whose breathing had become a shallow flutter, and his voice softened not with pity, but with an austere truth. "A living clue," he said. "And if he lives long enough to speak, we may yet put a name to the whisper behind the bricks." Vale's eyes, half-lidded, found Holmes's face. His lips moved. I leaned close to catch the words, "not." Ravens, he breathed. Not Hargreaves. It's thee. His breath failed. I pressed my fingers to his throat again, willing the pulse to remain. And in that moment I understood the final cruelty of our adversary, that even dying words could be sealed. Holmes straightened, very slowly, and spoke with a quiet bitterness that I had never heard from him before. He has made the world into a sealed room, he said, and he means to see what steps out of us when the air runs thin. Then, with a single decisive motion, he took up his coat. Come, Watson, he said. There is still one door we have not opened, Lady Hargreaves's ledgers. If he wishes to make history with wax and paper, we shall do what we have always done, read the smear at the margin, and find the hand that pressed too hard. And so, as the fog thickened once more against the panes, we left the broken seal and the bricked wall behind us, and went out again into London's darkness where every alley might conceal a whisper, and every respectable house might hide a door that was never meant to be found.